Hey guys, Sam here at NA Studios. Today I want to take a look at the Logic stock compressor, or more specifically, I want to take a look at the Logic stock compressor emulations compared to manufacturers' versions of them. Now, some of these are going to be paid versions, such as the ones from Waves or Slate Digital. Some of them, such as the Focusrite emulation, comes directly from Focusrite, and you can pay for it or you can get it for free if you have some Focusrite hardware. There are a lot of similarities between these. I think the Logic stock compressor got it absolutely bang on in a lot of situations, and in some it needs a bit of tweaking to get to the same sound as you do when the controls are set to be the same. Either way, let's jump straight in and take a look at how this compressor fares against its counterparts. So first off, let's familiarise ourselves with the Logic stock compressor. Let's go through the different emulations and see how they all sound and how they compare. For this, I'm going to go to the graph setting, as I find that it's easier to see the attack and release constants and how they change from emulation to emulation. Starting off with the Platinum, let's go through and hear how they sound on a drum loop. So we can hear there are some distinct differences there. Some differences in the characteristics of the overall sound and tone of them. The Platinum Digital, this is the regular Logic compressor that we used to get in all the old versions. This is quite clean, this is going to be transparent, this is not aiming to be anything in particular, this is just aiming to compress in a fairly transparent and neutral way. Studio VCA, this is modelled after the Focusrite Red 3 compressor. Now, of all the emulations, this is one of the more clean. This is not quite as smashy as some of the other ones. This is quite a transparent compressor, and you're not going to get too much character out of this unless you drive it quite hard. The familiar 1176, this is one of the more aggressive emulations in here. This can get really smashy. This is really fast on the attack, and we're going to come to that in a moment. But this compressor is really full of character and can be super aggressive. The classic VCA, this is modelled on the DBX 160. Now, this is also an aggressive and smashy compressor. It has that familiar knock that's known for working well on drums and bass guitar. Interestingly, with this emulation, we don't have any attack or release controls. We just have the threshold ratio and makeup gain. And that's going to become important a little bit later on. Then we have the vintage VCA, which is modelled after the SSL G series compressor. This one is a punchy compressor. It's not as smashy or powerful as the DBX and the 1176. You're still going to get that tightness to it, but it's meant as a kind of a glue compressor. It's meant to hold stuff together as opposed to having a real impactful sound on your audio. Following that, we have the vintage FET. Now, this is an interesting one because this is modelled on the 1176 revision H, which has no discernible differences from the previous revision, the G, other than it has a different faceplate on it. As far as I'm aware, there are no real one-to-one emulations of this in the software world. Nobody has said, right, we're going to emulate the actual Rev H, the silver face, because it is the same internally and sound-wise as the previous iterations, the black face. We're going to come on to that in a second as well. And then finally, we have the vintage Opto, which is modelled after the LA2A. And interestingly, with the LA2A, you only have two controls. You have gain or you have peak reduction. But in the same way as they could have left the other controls off as they did on the DBX, they've chosen not to in the Logic stock compressor. So we have a control over the knee, attack and release controls. And again, this is something that we're going to look at as we look at the different emulations. So the emulations that I've gone for, this is the Focusrite Red 3 compressor. This is the one that comes from Focusrite directly. Then for the 1176, I've gone for the Slate Digital 1176 emulation. This is a fantastic sounding compressor, and I think it gets pretty close to the original and indeed the Logic stock compressor, which is fairly good in terms of recreating the original 1176 sound. And then moving on, we've got the DBX 160. This is the one from Waves I've gone for. I'm not taking a look at any of the extra controls here. There's no need in this scenario. So we're just taking a look at the controls that are on here. Then I've gone for the SSL emulation, again from Slate Digital, the Virtual Bus Compressor FG Grey. Incidentally, I could have also used the Focusrite emulation from Slate Digital, but I thought when the Focusrite one is there, we might as well get the one that is directly from the company who made it. Then after that, for the Rev H, I've gone for the Waves CLA 76. Because there are no discernible differences in the sound between the Rev G and the Rev H, just that different colour faceplate, I didn't want to use the Slate Digital again. I thought it was worth using a different emulation. So I've got this one from Waves just to see how this one holds up. And then following that, for the LA2A, I've got the Slate Digital FG2A, which is a great sound in itself. It's now been kind of expanded into the custom Opto, in which you can change a lot more stuff in there. You can change the characteristics. But for this, we're just looking at the LA2A, so the FG2A is going to do a good job. So first up, let's go for the Focusrite emulation. Now, I've tried to match the attack and release as closely as I can, based on what the compressor actually is able to do. Most of these compressors aren't able to have the full attack and release range that the Logic stock compressor does. So I've looked at the manual, I've looked at what the constants are there and tried to match them up as closely as possible. Let's take a listen to how the stock compressor compares to the paid version. First, you're going to hear a bar of the stock, followed by paid, stock, and then paid. So you'll hear 4 bars in total. Let's take a listen. Now, the Focusrite has an attack range of 25 milliseconds up to 500 milliseconds. So the lowest range there, 25 milliseconds, I've taken it down to the fastest attack time, and then I've got the stock compressor on as close as I can get to 25. The release time goes from 100 milliseconds to just over a second, 1.1 seconds. So I've gone for 100 milliseconds on the release on the stock and down to 0.1, which is 100 milliseconds on the Focusrite. To my ear, there is quite a difference in the initial attack of the compressor. Take a listen once more to a bar of each and just listen to that initial transient. They're both at a ratio of 4:1. I feel like the Focusrite is grabbing that transient a little bit more. I've got the input set to 0 and the makeup gain set so that they are at the same level. It's actually +10. But the ratio is on the same. It's at -20 on the stock compressor and also on the Focusrite compressor. So there's some big differences there. What I'd like to do now is try and manipulate the Focusrite to sound a little bit more like the Logic stock compressor. So I'm going to be altering the threshold and possibly the attack and release time as well. Let's take a listen to that. So by bringing the Focusrite threshold up to around -15, we're actually getting a sound that is far more similar to that in the stock compressor. I've actually left the attack and release where they are because although it sounded like they were kind of off, I think they were just compressing a bit too much. So it seems like the main difference there is the attack and release sound pretty similar to me. The ratio is obviously at 4:1, but the threshold is at a slightly different point. If we've got it at -20 on the Logic stock compressor, then we need to bring it up to around -15 on the Focusrite compressor to get a really similar sound. Let's listen one more time and see how accurately we've been able to match those two sounds. I think without getting too far into it, those are pretty much as matched as you're going to get in a mix situation. If you have those two sat next to each other, I don't think it's going to be too easy to really tell the difference. So I think the Focusrite on the stock compressor, that emulation is pretty close, albeit having to set it at a slightly different threshold. Now the 1176, this is where things are going to get a bit more aggressive. First off, let's take a listen to the Logic stock compressor and then the Slate Digital, followed by stock and then Slate Digital. Now this, as we can hear, is a far more aggressive compressor. We're getting such a large amount more of the actual compression characteristic there. It is annihilating those transients. Now it's important to take a look at the attack and release constants, especially with the 1176, because this compressor is either fast or super fast. There's no real slow attack time. The attack goes from 0.02 milliseconds to 0.8 milliseconds. So that's 20 microseconds up to 800 microseconds. So we're not even getting an attack time of a millisecond there. It is crazy fast. And I've had to try and match this in the 1176 Slate Digital as well. Now the release is a different story. It's quite large span. It goes from 50 milliseconds up to over a second, 1.1 seconds. So we've got quite a large scope there, but only in the release time. So as we all know, with an 1176, the dials go kind of backwards. So in the Logic stock compressor, if we've got the attack time round to the left-hand side, as it were, all the way down, that's the fastest. But on an 1176, the traditional 1176, if you turn it all the way round to the right, all the way clockwise, that is the fastest. But because of those constants that I just mentioned, I've had to make the attack time on the Logic stock compressor 0.5 milliseconds to kind of keep up with the attack time on the Slate Digital emulation. So that's why they look a little bit off. It looks like the knobs are kind of different because they're scaled differently and sort of in reverse as well. Let's take another listen to those and try and notice any differences, and then we'll try and match them and see if we can actually get them to be as close as possible. So I've had to alter that attack time quite considerably. 0.5 milliseconds was the time on the stock compressor, but I've had to speed up the attack on the 1176 to almost as fast as it will go, so that it's actually in line with what's going on in the stock compressor. The release time is a very strange one in the 1176 because it has got such enormous scope. We'll actually find that a small change can make a massive difference. Let's just take a listen to that now. If I just loop a section with just the Slate Digital version and alter that release constant, we'll hear how a very small change can make a big difference. So just changing it to what these numbers are saying is kind of 0.5's worth of difference turns it into a completely different compressor. So with the 1176, you've got a massive amount of scope, but by altering that attack time slightly, we can get something that's pretty close to a Logic stock compressor. One thing that's worth noting here, though, is that the input and output are set kind of for your threshold. So you don't have a threshold, or rather you have an always set threshold, and you're just turning up the audio into that threshold so that the audio is actually being compressed some more. So I've had to alter that slightly. Typically, I would be turning up the input and turning down the output relative to each other. But in this instance, to get the same kind of sound as a stock compressor, I've had to kind of throw that rule out the window. But I think that the differences in these are now minute, now that we've adjusted those attack and release constants, and we're getting a very, very similar sound. Now, the DBX 160 emulation, in the Logic stock version, we have no control over attack or release. And similarly, in the Waves version, we have no control, just in the same way as we don't in the hardware. We just have ratio, threshold, and output gain. If you look at the documentation, it's a little cryptic. It kind of depends on how much the sound breaches the threshold and a host of other factors. So let's do what we can do, and let's take a listen. First off, you'll hear the Logic version, and then DBX, and then the same again. Now, it sounds like the DBX version, the Waves version, has got a bit more of that knock, which the compressor is famous for. So I'm going to try and match these as closely as possible. The threshold is another kind of cryptic one. We've got it going from 0.01 up to 3, and there's no real kind of indication about what these controls, what the numbers actually mean on them. So let's just take a listen to how it sounds when we try and match them. Let's just try and get them as close as possible, and then try and work out what that threshold actually means. Now, there are a lot of similarities there. I would say, to my ear, this is one of the ones that sounds most similar, albeit for one small factor, and that is the low end. I feel like the Waves version of the DBX is clamping down on that bottom end more than the Logic stock version is. So let's bring out this collapsed view at the moment. Let's bring in the sidechain and see if we can make it sound a bit more similar. Now, we do have the sidechain in the Logic stock compressor as well. We can tell it to listen to a certain frequency area or not listen to a certain frequency area. In this instance, we're going to tell it to not listen to the low end. I'm just going to try it with this button engaged and just see what the difference is, because I think that it's affecting that bottom end and making them not quite as similar as they perhaps could be. I don't feel like that's really made as much difference as I wanted it to. I don't think that's leveled them out as much as it could. So from this, we can kind of say that the overall characteristics of the two compressors are very similar. It's just that low end. The DBX is clamping down too much on that low end, or relative to the Logic stock compressor, it's clamping down too much. But when we bring in that high pass on the sidechain, it's not clamping down on it enough. So there are a lot of similarities there. They do sound very similar, but that bottom end is actually quite different between those two. Now onto the SSL emulation then. I'm using the Slate Digital Virtual Bus Compressors FG Grey. This is a great compressor for overall mix stuff, for mixed glue in inverted commas as they say, but I think these two are quite vastly different. The differences in these two outweigh the similarities in kind of overall tone. So the attack on the SSL goes from 0.1 milliseconds up to 30 milliseconds. So it's fairly fast overall. So on the Slate Digital one, I've got it up at 30, and then I've got the attack on the Logic Stock up at 30 as well. The release goes from 0.1 milliseconds up to 1.2 seconds, so you've got a real broad range there again. On the FG Grey, I've got this at 0.4, and then I've got this at 400, so it's 0.4 seconds on the FG Grey, which is the same as 400 milliseconds. But the differences are quite noticeable. With the ratio the same, 4:1, and the threshold the same, let's take a listen. Now, it sounds to me like the release constants there are quite vastly different. It sounds like the Slate Digital version is releasing a lot quicker, and we're not getting as much of the pumping sound on the ride cymbal. But then the Logic Stock compressor, we are really noticeably compressing and pumping that ride cymbal. Let's take a listen one more time, and then I'm going to alter the release parameter on the SSL, on the Slate Digital SSL, and see if we can get them sounding a bit more similar. Okay, so we've got them sounding a bit more similar in the release, but I think the attack is the issue here. We've got the Logic Stock compressor set to 30 or 29, as close as I can get it. But to my ear, it sounds like at 30, the Slate Digital one is too slow, but then at 10, it's too fast. Let's take a listen one more time and listen to that attack. Listen to how quickly it's chopping off that transient. First off, I'll put it at 30 milliseconds on the FG Grey, and then for the next time round, I'll bring it down to 10. And I think that 10 is too fast, but 30 is just too slow to match the Logic Stock compressor. At 30 or 30 milliseconds attack time, the FG Grey is not clamping down on the transient enough, but at 10, it's clamping down on it too much. So let's keep it at 30, and then let's alter the Logic Stock compressor and see if we can get that to be bang on the same. Okay, so still some real differences there. I've brought down the attack time to 56 milliseconds, and that sounds like it's a lot better matched. But the release time, I don't feel like I can get that right. I don't feel like I can really match that release time. I feel like the snare drum is really losing out because of it. I think that the bass drum is hitting that compressor hard, and it's bringing that overall level down, but then it's not releasing fast enough to actually let that snare drum come through. Let's take a listen again just to the FG Grey, and then we'll take a listen to the stock compressor and see if we can get that to kind of be a bit more matched. So you can hear that the compressor is allowing that snare to come through. It's not releasing too slowly. And you can also see on the meter that the needle is coming back before that snare hits. Let's take a listen to the Logic Stock compressor and see if we can get it to do the same thing. So bringing that to around 270 milliseconds is kind of having that same effect. It's letting the compressor react to that kick drum. It's still compressing the snare, but it's allowing the initial transient to come through. So we've had to affect the attack and release controls quite considerably to get them to sound the same. The release is now at 270, whereas on the FG Grey, it's at 200. So I don't think you can take these numbers as gospel. I don't think they're going to be exactly what they say on the tin. But with a little manipulation, you can get these two to sound far more similar than they do with the kind of written settings. So these ones take a little more manipulation on the SSL. Okay, so the Rev H, this is the tricky one that we don't have the exact replica of or the exact emulation of. I'm treating this one to be similar to the 1176. I know that the CLA 76 I'm using here is an emulation of the Revision D, but we're going to see exactly how close we can get it. So I've got the attack time down in the same region as it was on the regular 1176, so at 0.5 milliseconds. Release is up at 50. So on the CLA 76, I've got the attack at 3. Who knows what that really means. We do know that the attack range, as I said before, is between 20 microseconds and 800 microseconds. So somewhere just below the middle over here would be 800 microseconds. We can kind of suggest that that's maybe around 350 microseconds, something like that, with the attack time over here at 500 microseconds. So we're getting relatively close. But let's take a listen to them. Okay, so some pretty severe differences there. I think that the thing with the Logic stock compressor, when it gets down to a super fast attack time, so 0.5, it becomes far less accurate. I think that it's completely smashing the sound, but not in the same way as that 1176 is. So what we're going to have to do is bring the attack time of that 1176 all the time to the fastest, up to number 7. Remember, the 1176 is kind of backwards, so if it's all the way around to the left, that's slowest, all the way around to the right, that is the fastest. And let's see if that is altering it to make it more similar. It's not. So although we've got the attack time the same there, we said before that the release time, just by changing it very slightly, can turn it into a completely different compressor. So I'm going to bring that release time all the way to the fastest as well, and just see if that is going to be more similar to the stock compressor. Let's take another listen. I think the overall characteristic of it is fairly similar, but we're not compressing nearly enough. I'm going to adjust those input and output controls now. So the input is sending more signal up to the threshold, and the output is adjusting the output gain after it's been compressed. I'm going to see if we can get a sound that is more similar to that of the Logic stock compressor. Okay, so something I never thought I would say, the 1176 doesn't sound like it's compressing fast enough. It sounds like it's allowing too much of that transient to come through. So in the Logic stock compressor, it's completely flattening it, and the 1176 is just letting a little too much through. I think we could maybe alter that by bringing up the input and bringing down the output. Or similarly, we could alter the attack on the Logic stock compressor. Let's try and get the stock compressor to sound more like the 1176 in this instance. Let's bring that attack time up slightly. Okay, I think we're a bit closer there now. Interestingly, just by changing the attack time to 1 millisecond from half a millisecond, that helped. But what really helped there is changing the release time. The release time went up to 230 milliseconds, whereas we've got the CLA76 on its fastest 50 milliseconds time. So I think that overall the differences between these two are the attack and release. And to an extent, I think that's kind of to be expected, because with the 1176, it's such a complex thing, the attack and release, making it so fast, and with the threshold there as well, or the kind of the lack of a real adjustable threshold, I think you're asking the Logic stock compressor to do an awful lot there to mimic the sound of that when it's a completely different topology. But overall, definite similarities there. We can adjust the attack and release time on the Logic stock compressor this time to make it sound more like that CLA76. And although it's not a one-to-one Rev H emulation, it's 1176 nonetheless, and the overall sound is relatively similar. I think we've got it pretty close there. Now, the fabled LA2A. This is a difficult one, because on the LA2A, the FG2A, the Slate Digital version, we've just got peak reduction and gain. So we've just got those two controls, as you do in the original. With the Logic stock version, you've got the ability to manipulate the attack and release times as well, which I'm going to try not to do because I don't think it's really fair. What I've done is looked up the average attack and release time of an LA2A, and the average attack is 10 milliseconds, and the average release is 60 milliseconds. So I've put this on the attack and release here, so 10 and 60. And what I'm really worried about is the amount of compression, which is the peak reduction control on the FG2A. Let's take a listen to the two of them as they stand now, where I've matched them approximately, and we'll hear the similarities and we'll hear the differences. Some fairly noticeable differences there. I think that the FG2A is compressing far more than the Logic stock compressor. So let's rectify that. Let's leave the attack and release controls where they are for the moment, and let's just bring down that peak reduction control and see if we can get the amount of peak reduction to be a bit more similar. Okay, so the FG2A is far more aggressive than the Logic stock compressor version, and there are a few things at play here. I think the attack is wrong, the release is wrong, I think the threshold's wrong. I'm going to try and manipulate the Logic compressor here to try and emulate the sound of the FG2A. I've seen lots of A/B comparisons between the FG2A that Slate Digital has made and the real life version, and I've got to say they are fantastically close. So I think the FG2A is more the direction we want to be heading in. So let's alter the controls on the stock compressor to try and get them to match the FG2A. Okay, we're getting closer. I think if I remember rightly, the FG2A or the LA2A has a fixed 3-to-1 ratio. So let's see if we can change the Logic stock compressor to 3-to-1 and see if we can get it to be a bit more similar. So the differences there are far greater. I think with a bit more manipulation of the controls, we could possibly get it sounding a bit more similar. But what I've noticed is you can get the initial transients compressed around the same amount between the two of them, using the FG2A as kind of the control and then manipulating the logic compressor. But it's the release characteristics or the kind of ride cymbal and overall pumping. It's just not the same. There's no real adjective I can use to describe it, but it's not pumping enough, or it's not pumping too much, or it's not as smooth, or it's too smooth. It's just not the same. And I think with a compressor like this that is so full of character and has so little that you can actually manipulate, there's so much going on under the hood, as they would say, that it's going to be very, very difficult to actually emulate that realistically. So I think out of all of them, this is the one that is going to be the least similar. The SSL had a fair amount of differences. The DBX had a lot of similarities. This one I feel is the most different. All right, thanks for checking it out. I hope you found this useful. I think that the Logic stock compressor is such a phenomenal plugin, and to have the ability to change to all those different emulations is such a phenomenal thing. But it's important to remember that we need to stay objective with this and see what they're actually emulating and see how closely they emulate them. But at the same time, it's important to remember that for the most part, you're not going to be A-Bing between the Logic compressor and one that's meant to sound like what it emulates, because they're all emulations. None of them are the actual hardware. If you had the actual hardware, you'd use that. But having something that sounds very similar to it is always going to be useful and going to allow you to use these compressors in different scenarios. The 1176 and the DBX 160 are going to be your port of call for drums. They're smashy, they're aggressive. The SSL and the Focusrite, they're going to be more mixed bus kind of stuff. Your FG2A typically will be on a vocal or maybe a bass guitar where you want to compress and have that nice smooth characteristic. I don't think any of these are 100% bang on, but in the same way, I don't think any of them would be 100% exactly the same as the hardware either. So it's horses for courses. Thanks a lot for checking it out. Hope it's been useful. Make sure you subscribe and hit like, and I'll catch you again soon. Take care.